I want to talk to you tonight about a library. That sounds like a strange way to start a conversation about the presidency, but stay with me, because what happened on July 1st, 2026 in Medora, North Dakota tells you more about how this administration operates than almost anything else that's happened this year. The president traveled to the newly opened Theodore Roosevelt Presidential Library, $450 million, privately funded, sitting on 93 acres right next to Theodore Roosevelt National Park. It opens to the public on July 4th, which this year happens to be America's 250th anniversary. That timing is not an accident. Nothing about a presidential library opening is ever an accident. Now, before I say anything critical, and I'm going to say some critical things tonight, let me give credit where it's actually due. The president took part in the ribbon cutting. He accepted an invitation to donate his own Presidential Medal of Freedom, let me be precise here, Roosevelt's Medal of Honor, to the library alongside the medal earned by Roosevelt's son on D-Day. That's a real gesture. That's the kind of thing that, on its own, without context, looks like genuine respect for history. If that's all that had happened that day, I wouldn't be talking to you right now. But that's not all that happened. And the gap between what should have happened at a library dedicated to one of the most consequential conservationists in American history and what actually happened is the whole story. Let's start with who Theodore Roosevelt actually was, because I think most people watching this have a vague sense of him as a guy on Mount Rushmore with a mustache, and that does him a disservice. Roosevelt went out to the North Dakota Badlands in 1884 at 25 years old after his wife and his mother died on the exact same day. Think about that for a second. Same day, he went out west broken, and he came back a different man. The Badlands experience is the reason he became, by a wide margin, the most important conservation president this country has ever had. He built the Panama Canal. He signed the Antiquities Act. He created 5 national parks and 18 national monuments. He protected 230 million acres of land. That is Roosevelt's legacy, not the mustache, not the Rough Rider story everybody already knows. The land. The land is the legacy. So here's my first question for you tonight. If you are standing in a library built to honor that legacy on the 250th anniversary of the country, what do you talk about? I'll tell you what didn't get talked about. The current administration has, over the last 2 terms, rolled back protections on more than 100 million acres of protected land. The Endangered Species Act has been weakened. The Bureau of Land Management's conservation rule, which was designed to put conservation on equal footing with drilling and grazing on public lands, got rolled back. And just last month, in June of 2026, an executive order opened up more than 300 million acres of Pacific Ocean national monuments to commercial fishing. 300 million acres. That is not a footnote. That is a direct measurable reversal of the exact kind of protection Roosevelt spent his entire political life building. And at the library built in his name on the anniversary of his conservation achievements, none of that got mentioned. Not one word about the tension between what this administration has done to public lands and what Roosevelt dedicated his life to protecting. You can praise a man's ambition. You can praise his tariffs. You can praise the Panama Canal. But if you stand in front of his life's work and never once acknowledge the part of his legacy your own policies have been quietly dismantling, that's not tribute. That's selective memory. And selective memory, when it comes from the most powerful person in the country, is not an accident either. It's a choice about what story gets told and what story gets left on the cutting room floor. Now let's talk about the exhibit itself, because this is where things get, honestly, a little strange. The library features an AI exhibit called Talk with TR, built by Microsoft and a company called Lemon Slice, trained on Roosevelt's actual speeches, letters, and books. In theory, that's a remarkable idea, letting people ask questions of an AI trained on a historical figure's own words. That's the kind of thing that could genuinely bring history to life for a new generation. But here's what happened when the president used it. He asked the AI about the Panama Canal, arguably Roosevelt's single greatest infrastructure achievement. And instead of using that moment to talk about engineering, about ambition, about what it took to connect 2 oceans, the moment got repurposed into a political jab, the president told the crowd that Democrats, quote, gave the canal away, referencing the 1999 handover of the canal to Panama. Now let's just get the actual history straight, because facts still matter even when they're inconvenient. The treaty that set that handover in motion was signed in 1977. It was completed, and the transfer took place in 1999. That is a 22-year process spanning multiple administrations from both parties. It was not some overnight giveaway by one political party, but that nuance didn't make it into the speech. What made it into the speech was a punchline aimed at scoring a partisan point using a historical AI exhibit built to honor a Republican icon's greatest achievement at his own library on his own anniversary. That's the pattern I want you to notice tonight. Genuinely meaningful moments, a real donation, a real historical exhibit, keep getting used as a stage for something else, not honoring the man, scoring points. And then there's the joke about the medals. I want to spend a minute on this because I think it's more revealing than people realize. When the president donated Roosevelt's Medal of Honor to the library, alongside the medal Roosevelt's own son earned for his actions on D-Day, he made a joke. He said something about wishing he could give himself one too, and then added a comment about there being 3 of them now, cracking a joke using a phrase associated with a well-known song lyric about 3 of something. Now look, humor has its place. President's joke. Every president in history has used humor to connect with a crowd. But a Medal of Honor is not a normal object. It is the highest military honor this country gives. It exists because somebody, in Roosevelt's son's case on the beaches of Normandy, did something so brave under fire that the entire nation decided to remember it forever. When you're standing next to that object and the joke that comes out of your mouth is about wanting one for yourself, that tells you something about how the moment was being processed. Was this about honoring sacrifice, or was it about being seen next to something honorable? I'll let you draw your own conclusion there. But I'll say this, reverence and self-reference are not the same thing, and a library dedicated to a man who nearly died leading his own troops up a hill in Cuba is not the place to blur that line. Now, I want to widen the lens, because this ceremony did not happen in a vacuum. This same week, the Supreme Court issued a ruling expanding the president's power to remove heads of independent federal agencies. That ruling effectively overturns roughly 91 years of legal precedent going back to a case called Humphrey's Executor, which limited a president's ability to fire the heads of independent regulatory agencies without cause. 91 years. That's not a small legal tweak. That is a fundamental shift in how much unchecked power the executive branch now holds over agencies that were specifically designed by Congress to operate independently of political pressure. Think about the timing here. In the same week that the Supreme Court hands the presidency significantly more unilateral power, the president is standing at a library honoring a man whose entire brand, whose entire historical reputation was built on being a strong executive who used that strength within real institutional guardrails. Roosevelt busted trusts. Roosevelt took on powerful interests. But Roosevelt did it as a check on unaccountable power, not as an accumulation of it. There's a real difference between a strong presidency that expands protections for ordinary people and public lands and a strong presidency that expands its own authority to remove the very officials meant to hold it accountable. Standing at Roosevelt's library the same week the distinction gets erased by the Supreme Court is, at minimum, an irony worth noticing. At most, it's a signal about which version of executive power this administration actually wants to be associated with and which version it just wants to borrow the branding from. There's a smaller detail here, too, that I think matters more than people give it credit for. The president also claimed in his remarks that his administration had, quote, ripped back 90 acres of land for the library from the federal government. I want to be careful here because I don't have full visibility into the specific transaction being referenced, but the framing itself tells you something. The word choice, ripped, frames a routine federal land transfer as some kind of aggressive personal victory over the government he himself runs. That's a strange way to describe your own administration handing over land to a project you're standing in front of. It's the language of conquest applied to paperwork. And when you start describing your own government's routine actions using the language of a fight, a heist, a ripoff, that tells you something about how every single action, even administrative ones, gets converted into a story about winning. Let's also talk briefly about how the president got there and who introduced him, because the little details usually tell you more than the big speech does. He arrived on Air Force One, the same plane that, according to reporting, was partially funded by a gift from Qatar, a detail that's become a recurring point of controversy, given questions about foreign influence and ethics around that arrangement. And Interior Secretary Doug Burgum, who introduced the president that day, at one point in his introduction referred to Roosevelt's Panama Canal achievement, while also taking a shot at, quote, communists, a strange and almost anachronistic insult to reach for at a ribbon cutting for a library. Little things, but little things at a ceremony like this are rarely accidental. They tell you what's actually on people's minds, even when the big speech is supposed to be about legacy and unity. So where does this leave us? I don't think what happened in Medora on July 1st was a scandal. Nobody broke the law by cutting a ribbon. Nobody committed a crime by donating a medal or cracking an awkward joke. But I do think it was revealing in the way that ceremonies often are. A library, a real, genuinely impressive $450 million library built to honor one of the most significant conservationist presidents this country has ever had, became for one afternoon a stage for partisan point scoring, a stage for self-reference dressed up as tribute, and a stage where the most obvious, glaring omission conservation, the administration's own rollback of the very conservation legacy being celebrated, never once got acknowledged out loud. Here's what I keep coming back to. Theodore Roosevelt's entire legacy rests on the idea that public land belongs to everyone, not to the highest bidder, not to whoever holds power in a given decade, but to the country as a whole, forever. That is a genuinely American idea, and it's one that has historically found support across party lines. Conservation was never supposed to be a partisan issue. And if we are going to spend the next few years watching every historical commemoration turn into a campaign moment, if we are going to watch legacy get selectively edited depending on which parts are politically convenient that week, then we are the ones responsible for noticing it and saying something about it regardless of which party is doing it. Roosevelt didn't protect 230 million acres of this country by making jokes at ribbon cuttings. He did it by fighting powerful interests who wanted to strip that land for short-term profit, the same kind of interest being handed back access to public lands and waters right now. If we actually want to honor him, the honoring has to include the uncomfortable parts too. It has to include a real reckoning with the fact that his conservation vision and this administration's actual policy record are moving in opposite directions. So the question I'll leave you with tonight isn't really about one speech in North Dakota. It's about all of us. Are we going to let legacy become just another word people use for whatever story is convenient this week? Or are we going to hold every leader on every side to the actual historical record, the parts that flatter them and the parts that don't? That's the real test of whether we still take history seriously in this country. Not whether we can cut a ribbon in front of a beautiful new building, but whether we can stand in front of it and tell the whole truth. If this kind of breakdown is useful to you, subscribe to this channel so you don't miss the next one. Drop your thoughts in the comments, and I'll see you in the next video.